What would you do if the exhausted waitress serving your coffee suddenly dropped to her knees, sobbing that she needed a husband by tomorrow morning? Most people would walk away, but Aiden, a single dad drowning in medical debt, didn't. He stood up. He thought he was saving a desperate woman from ruin. He had no idea the woman in the stained apron wasn't a waitress at all. She was a ruthless billionaire CEO, and this marriage was about to change both their lives forever. The rain in Boston that night wasn't just falling, it was punishing. It came down in sharp, freezing sheets that battered the pavement of Tremont Street, washing away the grime of the city but doing absolutely nothing to cleanse the absolute disaster that had become Zoe Carmichael's life. Zoe was supposed to be at the Ritz-Carlton. She was supposed to be wearing a custom Vera Wang gown, sipping vintage Dom Perignon, and smiling for the society photographers at her rehearsal dinner. Tomorrow was her 30th birthday. Tomorrow, she was supposed to marry Richard Hastings, a blue-blooded venture capitalist, thereby fulfilling the ironclad archaic clause in her late grandfather's will. Marriage by 30, or forfeit the controlling shares of Carmichael Global. It was a multi-billion-dollar empire built on shipping logistics and real estate, and it was hers by right, by blood, and by years of 80-hour work weeks. But less than an hour ago, Zoe had walked into the bridal suite to find Richard, her supposed partner in this corporate alliance, entangled on the velvet chaise lounge with Stephanie, Zoe's own director of public relations. The betrayal hadn't shattered Zoe's heart. She had never truly loved Richard, recognizing him only as a necessary pawn. But it had shattered her empire. The wedding was off. The trust fund was effectively dead. By midnight tomorrow, her Uncle Arthur, a man who had been trying to bankrupt the company for a decade, would seize control. In a blind panic, still wearing her diamond-encrusted engagement ring and a silk slip dress, Zoe had fled the hotel. She had run through the downpour, slipping through alleys to avoid the paparazzi tipped off by her sudden departure. Shivering and soaked to the bone, she had stumbled into the first open door she saw, a glowing neon sign reading Mabel's 24-hour diner. It was a run-down, greasy spoon that, ironically, Carmichael Global owned through a shell corporation. The night manager, a teenager named Toby who was too busy scrolling on his phone to look up, hadn't recognized one of the most powerful women in North America. When Zoe, desperate to hide from a group of journalists who had just sprinted past the window, saw a spare, mustard-yellow waitress apron hanging on a hook near the kitchen. She had grabbed it. She threw it over her expensive dress, tied it around her waist, and grabbed a coffee pot. For 2 hours, she pretended to work. She poured burnt coffee. She wiped down sticky tables. She hid in plain sight, her mind spiraling into a dark, suffocating abyss. I need a husband. I need a husband by 8 a.m. tomorrow, or I lose everything. It was 11:30 p.m. Sitting in the corner booth of the diner was Aiden Hensley. Aiden was a man who looked exactly how a Tuesday night in November felt, worn out, chilled, and hanging by a thread. At 32, his life had been reduced to a series of exhausting shifts as an independent contractor, installing drywall by day and fixing up cars by night. But his rough, calloused hands were gentle as they adjusted the frayed blanket over the sleeping 7-year-old girl in the booth across from him. His daughter, Ava. Ava's breathing was shallow. She was supposed to be at Boston Children's Hospital right now, resting comfortably after a critical cardiac valve replacement performed by Dr. Kenneth Lynn, the best pediatric cardiologist in the state. Instead, they were in a diner, splitting a $4 plate of pancakes because Aiden's insurance claim had been denied that morning. The procedure was considered experimental by the soulless adjusters at the insurance firm. The out-of-pocket cost was $42,500. He had $200 in his savings account. Aiden rubbed his temples, staring at the cold black coffee in his mug. The hospital had given him 48 hours to secure the funds, or Ava would lose her surgical slot. Pushing her back to the bottom of a wait list, she didn't have the time to survive. He heard a quiet sob. Aiden looked up. The new waitress, a striking woman with drenched, ruined hair, wearing a mustard apron over what looked like a soaking wet silk slip, was standing by the pie case. Her hands were gripping the chrome counter so tightly, her knuckles were bone white. She was trembling violently, tears slicing through the streaked mascara on her cheeks. "Hey," Aiden called out softly, not wanting to wake Ava. "Miss, you all right?" Zoe didn't hear him. She was staring at the clock on the wall. 11:45 p.m. The walls of the diner were closing in. The weight of her grandfather's legacy, the smirking face of her Uncle Arthur, the ruined empire. It was all crashing down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the checkerboard linoleum floor, burying her face in her hands. A jagged, broken sob tearing from her throat. Aiden was out of his booth in a second. He knelt beside her, his heavy work boots squeaking on the wet floor. "Hey, hey," he said, his deep voice calm, steadying. He reached out, hesitating, before resting a warm, rough hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, just breathe. What's going on? Are you hurt?" Zoe looked up at him through a blur of tears. She saw a man in a faded flannel shirt, a Carhartt jacket dusted with drywall powder, and eyes that held a profound, quiet kindness. "I'm losing it," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm losing everything I've ever built. I'm losing my whole life." "Okay," Aiden said gently. "What do you need? Should I call someone? The police?" "No!" Zoe grabbed his forearm, her manicured nails digging into his jacket. "No police. No one can know." Her eyes darted around frantically. I need a husband." The absurdity of the words tasted like ash in her mouth, but the desperation forced them out. "I need a husband by tomorrow morning, or I'm ruined." Aiden stared at her, stunned. He looked at the cheap apron. He looked at her tear-streaked face. In his mind, the story wrote itself. She was an immigrant, facing deportation. Or maybe she was running from a dangerous ex-partner who controlled her finances. He had seen desperate people in his neighborhood before, driven to the edge by systems built to crush them. "A husband," Aiden repeated, his voice dropping to a low, cautious whisper. "Lady, you're not making sense." "I have money," Zoe blurted out. She couldn't reveal who she was. Not yet. If she said she was a billionaire, he would think she was insane. Or worse, he might try to extort her. "I have savings. If you or anyone can marry me at the courthouse tomorrow morning, just legally, just on paper, I will pay you." Aiden's heart did a strange, violent stutter in his chest. Money. He glanced back at his booth. Ava shifted in her sleep, her small face pale under the harsh diner lights. He thought of Dr. Lynn's grim expression. He thought of the $40,500 that stood between his little girl and a future. Aiden turned back to the trembling woman on the floor. He swallowed hard. "How much?" The diner hummed with the low buzz of the ancient refrigerator and the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. Zoe stared at the man kneeling beside her. His question, "How much?" hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of mascara on her skin. She had to play this carefully. She calculated the amount that would be life-changing for a working-class man, but not so astronomical that it sounded like a hallucination. $50,000, Zoe whispered. Aiden physically recoiled, pulling back as if she had struck him. He stared at her, his mind reeling. 50,000. It was exactly what he needed for the surgery, plus enough to cover Ava's recovery and keep a roof over their heads. It was a miracle wrapped in a bizarre, desperate package. But miracles didn't happen to guys like Aiden Hensley. There had to be a catch. 50 grand, he said, his eyes narrowing slightly with suspicion. For a piece of paper? Lady, waitresses don't just have 50 grand lying around. Who are you running from? Is it the mob? Are you in danger? Zoe let out a dark, breathless laugh that ended in a hiccup. The mob would be easier to deal with. No one is going to hurt you. It's a legal issue, an inheritance thing. If I'm not legally married by my 30th birthday, which is tomorrow, I lose a trust fund my grandfather left me. A very, very large trust fund. My fiancé just slept with my co-worker, and I walked out. If I don't walk into a courthouse by 9 a.m., my uncle takes everything, and I am left with nothing. Aiden searched her eyes. He was looking for deception, for the glint of a con artist. But all he saw was raw, unfiltered panic. She was terrified. I'll sign whatever you want, Zoe continued, her voice gaining a fraction of its usual CEO authority, though it was still shaky. A prenuptial agreement stating you have no liability for any of my debts, and I have no claim to your assets. We stay married on paper for 6 months to satisfy the legal requirements. Then we file for a quiet annulment, and the moment the ink is dry on the marriage certificate tomorrow, I will wire $50,000 directly into your bank account. Aiden looked away from her, his gaze drifting back to Ava, his beautiful, fragile daughter. He had spent the last 3 days begging banks for a loan, getting denied because of a foreclosure from 5 years ago when his ex-wife had walked out on them. He had sold his truck. He had pawned his grandfather's watch. Nothing was enough. I am a good father, he thought. Good fathers do whatever it takes. He turned his attention back to Zoe. He reached out and grabbed her elbow, helping her up from the sticky floor. They stood in the quiet corner of the diner, 2 strangers standing on the edge of a cliff. I'm Aiden, he said, his voice flat, businesslike. Zoe, she replied, smoothing down the mustard apron. All right, Zoe, Aiden said, crossing his arms. I'll do it, but I have terms. Zoe blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in his demeanor. Terms? Yeah. First, the money doesn't go to me. It goes directly to Boston Children's Hospital, to the billing department, in the name of Ava Hensley. Any remainder goes to my account. Zoe looked over his shoulder at the sleeping girl. A pang of unexpected empathy struck her chest. She's sick? She needs a heart valve, Aiden said, his jaw tightening. It costs $42,500. If she doesn't get it by Friday, she's off the schedule. Zoe felt a sudden wave of shame. Here she was, crying over a corporate takeover, while this man was fighting for his daughter's life. She nodded immediately. Done. I'll make the transfer from my phone. The second we have the certificate. Second, Aiden continued, stepping closer, his imposing height forcing Zoe to look up at him. You say there's no danger. If anyone comes looking for you, if some angry ex or some loan shark shows up at my door and scares my kid, the deal is off, and I will destroy whatever paperwork you need me to sign. Understood. Understood, Zoe said without hesitation. There's no physical danger, just corporate lawyers, and they won't bother you. Third, Aiden said, pulling a pen from his flannel shirt pocket. He grabbed a paper napkin from the dispenser on the counter. We write the agreement down right now. Both sign it. It ain't a lawyer's office, but it's proof of the transaction. Zoe, who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with armies of corporate attorneys, almost smiled. There was something intensely grounding about this man. He wasn't intimidated. He was practical. For the next 20 minutes, they sat at a booth, 2 rows down from Ava. Aiden wrote out the terms in blocky, precise handwriting. Zoe reviewed it. It was surprisingly sound. It stipulated the marriage was purely a business transaction. 0 cohabitation required. Immediate payment upon proof of marriage, and an annulment to be filed at Zoe's expense in exactly 180 days. Zoe signed her name, Zoe Carmichael. Aiden signed his, Aiden Hensley. City Hall opens at 8:30 a.m., Aiden said, folding the napkin and putting it in his jacket pocket. I have to drop Ava off with my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, at 7. I'll meet you on the steps of the Cambridge City Hall at 8:15. Don't be late. I won't be, Zoe said. She reached into the pocket of her wet dress beneath the apron and pulled out a heavy, platinum card. A black Amex. She handed it to Toby, the oblivious teenager at the register, paying for Aiden's pancakes and a massive tip to keep the kid quiet, before turning back to Aiden. Thank you, she said, her voice dropping its corporate edge. You have no idea what you're saving me from. Aiden looked at her, tired, beautiful face. We're saving each other. Zoe, see you in the morning. As Aiden carried his sleeping daughter out into the rain, Zoe pulled out her phone. It was completely dead. She had 8 hours to find a charger, dodge the press, and secure her empire. The morning light broke over Boston in a harsh, cold gray, the storm having passed but leaving a bitter chill in its wake. Aiden stood on the concrete steps of Cambridge City Hall, shifting uncomfortably in his suit. It was a navy blue 2-piece he had bought at a Goodwill 7 years ago for a friend's funeral. The shoulders were slightly too broad, and the cuffs were a half-inch too short. He had spent 20 minutes trying to iron the wrinkles out of the collar of his white shirt, but it still looked tired. He felt ridiculous. More than that, he felt terrified. He had dropped Ava off at Mrs. Higgins's apartment an hour ago, kissing her forehead and promising he would be back by lunch with good news. He hadn't slept a wink. He kept expecting to wake up and realize the encounter in the diner was a stress-induced fever dream. What sane man agrees to marry a weeping waitress for 50 grand? He checked his watch. 8:12 a.m. A sleek black Uber pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and Aiden's breath hitched in his throat. The woman who stepped out was not the broken, mascara-streaked waitress from the diner. Zoe had gone back to a boutique hotel, bought a charger, and spent the night orchestrating her survival. She was wearing a sharply tailored, cream-colored trench coat, cinched tightly at the waist, over a simple but undeniably expensive black sheath dress. Her dark hair was blown out in a sleek, powerful cut. She wore dark sunglasses, which she removed as she walked up the steps. Her eyes were clear, calculating, and piercingly sharp. Aiden frowned, stepping forward. Zoe. Aiden, she said, offering a tight, professional smile. You made it. Yeah, he said, looking her up and down. You look different. I had time to clean up, she'd said smoothly, avoiding his gaze as she walked past him toward the heavy brass doors of the building. Let's get this done. We need a judge, a witness, and the paperwork. They walked through metal detectors and navigated the maze of municipal hallways. The air was thick with the smell of floor wax and old paper. They paid the fees, filled out the marriage license application, and sat in a sterile waiting room. The silence between them was heavy. Aiden kept stealing glances at her. Her posture was flawless. She tapped away on a brand new iPhone, her thumbs flying across the screen at lightning speed, firing off emails. The vulnerability he had seen the night before was completely gone, replaced by an armor of pure, intimidating competence. "Are you sure about this?" Aiden finally asked, his voice low. "If you're in some kind of trouble, money trouble, taking out a loan to pay me 50 grand is just going to put you in a deeper hole." Zoe stopped typing. She looked at him, her expression softening just a fraction. This man was risking everything for his daughter, and he was still worried about her finances. The guilt of lying to him flared up in her chest, but she couldn't risk telling him the truth. If he knew she was worth $3 billion, he might demand half. He had seemed honest, but she had learned the hard way with Richard that money poisoned everyone. "I'll be fine, Aiden," she said, quietly. "The money is secure. Just focus on Ava." "Hensley and Carmichael," a voice called out. A bored-looking clerk motioned them toward a set of double doors. They walked into a small, wood-paneled courtroom. Judge Brenda Velez, a woman who looked like she hadn't had a vacation in a decade, barely looked up from her files. "We're skipping the romance," Judge Velez said, monotonously. "Do you, Aiden Hensley, take Zoe Carmichael to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Aiden said. His voice echoed slightly in the empty room. "Do you, Zoe Carmichael, take Aiden Hensley to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Zoe swallowed. The image of Richard and Stephanie flashed in her mind, immediately replaced by the image of her Uncle Arthur smirking in the boardroom. She looked at Aiden, a stranger with calloused hands and a fierce love for his child. "I do," Zoe said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I pronounce you husband and wife. Sign here, here, and here, next." It was over in 3 minutes. They signed the marriage certificate. The clerk stamped it with a heavy thud. Zoe snatched the certified copy of the marriage license with an eagerness that made Aiden raise an eyebrow. She practically vibrated with adrenaline. "This is it," she muttered to herself. "It's done." They walked back out of the courtroom, down the echoing hallways, and out into the crisp morning air. "All right," Aiden said, stuffing his hands into his suit pockets to stop them from shaking. "The hospital's billing department opens at 9. I need you to make that transfer." "Right now," Zoe said. She didn't reach for her phone. Instead, she looked toward the street. A massive, armor-plated black Maybach 62 swept around the corner, gliding silently to the curb directly in front of them. The sheer size and luxury of the vehicle made people on the sidewalk stop and stare. Aiden took a step back, his protective instincts flaring. "Zoe, what is that?" The passenger door of the Maybach swung open. A man stepped out. He was in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke Brioni suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He looked like the kind of man who bought and sold countries for sport. He held a leather briefcase in one hand. The man walked directly toward them, ignoring Aiden completely, and bowed his head slightly to Zoe. "Good morning, Mrs. Hensley," the man said, his voice crisp and deferential. "Happy birthday. I have reviewed the certificate via the photo you texted. The marriage is legally binding. I have already filed the injunction against your uncle. His takeover attempt is officially dead." Zoe let out a long, shuddering breath, a triumphant smirk touching her lips. "Thank you, Thomas." Aiden stared at the scene, his brain short-circuiting. "Zoe," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell is going on? Who is this guy?" Zoe finally turned to face him. The charade was over. She stood taller, the full weight of her identity settling onto her shoulders. "Aiden, this is Thomas Sterling, sorry. Thomas Avery," she corrected smoothly. "Chief Legal Counsel for Carmichael Global. And She hesitated, seeing the dawning horror in Aiden's eyes. "I am the CEO of Carmichael Global." Thomas Avery opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. "Mr. Hensley," the lawyer said, tapping the screen. "Per the agreement drafted on a napkin last night, which, frankly, gave me a heart attack. I have just initiated a wire transfer of $50,000 to Boston Children's Hospital." Aiden didn't look at the tablet. He was staring at the woman he had just married. The waitress in the mustard apron was gone. In her place was a titan of industry who had just bought him like a used car. "You're a billionaire," Aiden breathed out, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You lied to me." "I omitted the truth to protect my assets," Zoe said, stepping forward, her tone shifting back to the commanding cadence of a CEO. "But I kept my word. Your daughter gets her surgery today. We are square." Before Aiden could respond, a swarm of black SUVs turned the corner, screeching to a halt behind the Maybach. Doors flew open, flashes from cameras began firing like strobe lights. The paparazzi had found her. Zoe Carmichael, is it true the wedding was cancelled? Who is this man?" A reporter screamed, shoving a microphone toward them. Zoe's eyes widened. She grabbed Aiden's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his cheap suit. "Get in the car," she hissed, her iron composure cracking. "I'm going to the hospital," Aiden snapped, pulling away. "Our deal is done. Aiden, if you walk away now, they will dig into everything. Your life, Ava, the surgery. They will turn your daughter into a tabloid spectacle." Zoe yelled over the din of the reporters. "Get in the damn car." Aiden looked at the flashing cameras. He looked at the sharks circling them. He had made a deal with the devil to save his angel. And now, it seemed, he was dragging his daughter straight into hell, gritting his teeth. Aiden ducked his head and followed his billionaire wife into the back of the Maybach. The doors slammed shut, plunging them into soundproof luxury as the car sped away, leaving their old lives entirely behind. The interior of the Maybach was a masterclass in suffocating silence. The thick, bulletproof glass completely muted the screaming paparazzi and the chaotic Boston traffic outside. Inside, the only sound was the soft whir of the climate control and the frantic clicking of Zoe's fingernails against the screen of her phone. Aiden sat stiffly against the butter-soft leather, his cheap suit feeling like sandpaper against his skin. He felt like a hostage. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands shaking slightly, and dialed Mrs. Higgins. "Aiden, have you got the money, honey?" The older woman's voice crackled through the receiver. "I got it," Aiden said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sending the confirmation to the hospital right now. Get Ava to the surgical ward. I'll be there as soon as I can." He hung up and turned to Thomas Avery, the silver-haired lawyer sitting opposite them. Thomas silently handed Aiden an iPad displaying the confirmed wire transfer of $50,000 to Boston Children's Hospital. The receipt was stamped, legally binding and irrevocable. A massive weight lifted off Aiden's chest, followed immediately by a suffocating wave of new panic. He looked at Zoe. "Stop the car," Aiden demanded. "Ava is going into pre-op. Our deal was for a signature. Zoe, you have it. I am going to my daughter." Zoe didn't look up from her phone. "Thomas, explain it to him." The lawyer adjusted his silk tie. "Mr. Hensley, while the marriage certificate satisfies the immediate, literal requirement of the late Mr. Carmichael's will, Zoe's uncle, Arthur Carmichael, is not a man who accepts defeat gracefully. He has a team of litigators who will immediately file an injunction claiming this marriage is a fraudulent maneuver designed solely to circumvent the trust's conditions. Aiden's jaw tightened. It is a fraudulent maneuver. In spirit, perhaps, Thomas replied smoothly. But legally, it is a binding contract. However, if you are not seen together, if you do not establish a credible narrative of a whirlwind romance, Arthur will convince a judge to nullify the union on the grounds of corporate fraud. If that happens, the trust is frozen, and if the trust is frozen, Zoe's assets are seized. Zoe finally looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Aiden's. The vulnerability from the diner was completely gone, replaced by the ruthlessness that had made her a billionaire by 29. If they freeze my assets, Aiden, they freeze the accounts that just paid for your daughter's surgery. The hospital will demand the funds, the wire will be clawed back, and Ava's operation will be cancelled mid-prep. Aiden's blood ran cold. The threat wasn't delivered with malice, but with cold, calculating facts. You're blackmailing me. I am surviving, Zoe corrected, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. And I am making sure you survive, too. I need you to play the part, just for a little while, starting right now. The Maybach pulled into a subterranean parking garage beneath a towering glass and steel skyscraper. Carmichael Global was etched into the granite walls. Before Aiden could argue, the doors were opened by security personnel. Zoe grabbed his hand. Her grip was tight, her palm slightly sweaty, betraying the icy facade she wore. Follow my lead. Do not look intimidated. They rode a private elevator to the 60th floor in silence. When the chrome doors slid open, they stepped into a sprawling boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor. Sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table was Arthur Carmichael. Arthur was a large man with a florid face, wearing a custom tweed suit that failed to hide his expanding waistline. He held a crystal glass of scotch, despite it being barely 10 in the morning. Around him stood 3 lawyers who looked like predatory birds. Zoe, darling, Arthur drawled, not bothering to stand up. I see you've been busy. A courthouse wedding, without even inviting your favorite uncle. I must say, the press is having an absolute field day. They're calling it a mental breakdown. Zoe marched into the room, her chin held high, Aiden still firmly grasping her hand. Hello, Arthur. I believe Thomas sent over the paperwork. The marriage clause is satisfied. My shares vest at midnight. Arthur chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. He set his glass down. Oh, I saw the paperwork, and I did a little digging. He pointed a thick, manicured finger at Aiden. Aiden Hensley, 32, independent contractor, currently staring down a mountain of medical debt, 2 months behind on rent, and your last known purchase was a $4 plate of pancakes at a diner my company happens to own. Arthur leaned forward, his smile turning venomous. You bought a husband, Zoe, and a cheap one at that. I have a judge on standby who will throw this sham out of court before lunchtime. You're done. Aiden felt Zoe's hand tremble within his. She was cornered. Arthur had moved faster than she anticipated. The lawyers stepped forward, placing a stack of documents on the table. Sign the surrender of shares, Zoe, Arthur ordered. Save yourself the public humiliation. Aiden looked at the smug billionaire. He looked at the trembling woman holding his hand. He thought about the men in expensive suits who had sat behind polished desks and told him his daughter's life wasn't worth the insurance payout. He hated men like Arthur. Aiden let go of Zoe's hand and stepped forward. He placed his rough, calloused hands flat on the polished mahogany table and leaned into Arthur's space. My name is Aiden Hensley, Aiden said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded the massive room. "And I don't give a damn about your shares, your company, or your lawyers. I met your niece when she was crying on a diner floor, because the man she thought she loved betrayed her. I married her because she needed someone who wasn't going to stab her in the back, something you clearly know nothing about." Arthur's smug smile faltered. The lawyers exchanged uncertain glances. Aiden stood up straight, towering over the seated older man. "You want to take us to court? Do it. Put me on a stand. I will tell the entire world how the great Arthur Carmichael tried to steal a company from his grieving niece on her 30th birthday by dragging a sick little girl through the mud. Let's see what that does to your stock prices, Arthur." The room fell, dead silent. Zoe stared at Aiden, utterly blindsided. He wasn't just playing a part. He was going to war for her. Arthur's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "This isn't over. Zoe, I will tear this apart." He stormed out of the boardroom, his legal team scurrying after him like frightened mice. When the doors clicked shut, Zoe let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Aiden, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and genuine respect. "That was—" Zoe started. "Save it," Aiden interrupted, adjusting his cheap suit jacket. "I did what you paid me to do. Now, I am going to the hospital to see my daughter, and if you're as smart as you think you are, you'll come with me. The press is waiting downstairs, right?" Zoe swallowed hard. "Yes." "Then let's go act like newlyweds," Aiden said. The surgical waiting room at Boston Children's Hospital smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and collective anxiety. It was a world away from the mahogany and scotch of the Carmichael boardroom. Zoe sat stiffly in a molded plastic chair, her expensive trench coat folded neatly over her lap. She felt entirely out of place. The mothers around her wore sweatpants and exhausted expressions. She wore a $1,000 dress and a diamond ring the size of a marble. Aiden sat 2 chairs away. He had his head in his hands, his elbows resting on his knees. He had been like this for 3 hours. The imposing, fierce man who had backed down her ruthless uncle was gone, replaced by a terrified father waiting for news on a complex pediatric cardiac surgery. Zoe watched him from the corner of her eye. She had spent her entire life surrounded by men who only cared about acquisitions, margins, and power. Richard, her ex-fiancé, would have complained about the terrible Wi-Fi in the hospital by now. But Aiden was completely anchored to the operating room down the hall. Slowly, awkwardly, Zoe reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a cup of coffee she had convinced an aide to fetch from the cafeteria. She leaned over and nudged Aiden's arm. "Here," she said softly. Aiden looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He took the paper cup. "Thanks." "Dr. Lynn is the best," Zoe offered, trying to find words of comfort, a skill she rarely practiced. "I looked him up on the ride over. His success rate for this specific valve replacement is 99%. Aiden offered a weak, exhausted smile. "You did background research on my kid's surgeon?" "I like data. It reduces uncertainty," Zoe said, staring straight ahead at a poster of a cartoon bear holding a stethoscope. "It's going to be okay, Aiden." Before Aiden could respond, the heavy double doors of the waiting room banged open. "Where is she?" a voice barked. Zoe's blood ran cold. Standing in the doorway, looking frantic and furious, was Richard Hastings. He was wearing a rumpled tuxedo shirt, clearly hung over from the ruined rehearsal dinner. His eyes locked onto Zoe, and he marched across the linoleum floor, completely ignoring the startled families around them. "What the hell is going on?" "Zoe," Richard demanded, towering over her. "You walk out on me. You disappear. And I wake up to read on page 6 that you married some nobody at City Hall. Are you insane?" Zoe stood up, her corporate armor slamming back into place. "Keep your voice down, Richard. We are in a hospital." "I don't care where we are," Richard hissed, grabbing her wrist roughly. "This is a stunt to get back at me. You're throwing away our merger, our family's money, over one stupid mistake with Stephanie. Cancel this sham. Pay off whatever garbage man you hired, and come back to the hotel. We can still salvage the press release." Zoe tried to yank her arm away, but Richard's grip was shockingly tight. A flash of genuine fear spiked in her chest. Suddenly, a large, calloused hand clamped down on Richard's shoulder. Aiden didn't yell. He didn't posture. He simply applied enough crushing pressure to Richard's collarbone that the wealthy venture capitalist gasped and let go of Zoe's wrist. Aiden stepped between them. He was a good 3 inches taller than Richard, and significantly broader. "The lady told you to keep your voice down," Aiden said, his voice carrying a quiet, dangerous authority. "And I'm telling you not to touch my wife again." Richard rubbed his shoulder, sneering at Aiden's cheap suit. "Who the hell do you think you are? You think you belong in her world. She bought you to secure a trust fund. You're a pawn. Once the ink dries on whatever contract you signed, she's going to toss you back in the gutter." "Maybe," Aiden said calmly. "But right now, I'm the guy standing between you and the exit. Walk away." Richard looked at Aiden's steady, unwavering gaze. He realized, very quickly, that this wasn't a corporate negotiation where he could leverage his family name. If he pushed, this man was going to put him through a wall. "You're making a massive mistake, Zoe," Richard spat, adjusting his cuffs. "Arthur is going to eat you alive." He turned and stormed out of the waiting room. Zoe stood frozen, rubbing her wrist where Richard's fingers had dug in. She looked at Aiden, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nobody had ever stood up for her like that. Not her grandfather, not her absent parents, and certainly not Richard. "Are you okay?" Aiden asked, his voice softening instantly as he turned to her. "I'm fine," she whispered. "Thank you." Before the moment could settle, a man in green surgical scrubs pushed through the doors. "Doctor," Kenneth Lynn pulled off his surgical cap, looking exhausted, but smiling. Aiden stepped forward, his breath hitching. "Dr. Lynn." "The surgery was a complete success, Mr. Hensley," the surgeon said warmly. "Ava is a fighter. The new valve is functioning perfectly. She's in recovery right now. You can see her in about 20 minutes. Aiden let out a choked sob. The imposing, tough man shattered right in front of Zoe. He covered his face with his hands, weeping openly, his knees buckling slightly, the unbearable weight of the last 3 years finally lifting off his shoulders. Without thinking, Zoe stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It was a clumsy, unpracticed embrace. She didn't know how to comfort people, but she held on to him tightly. To her surprise, Aiden wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her shoulder as he cried. For a brief, suspended moment in a sterile hospital hallway, the billionaire and the drywaller clung to each other, bonded by the chaotic, beautiful mess they had just created. 4 days later, the media frenzy outside Boston Children's Hospital had reached a fever pitch. Carmichael Global's PR team, operating strictly under Zoe's new iron-fisted directives, had spun the narrative beautifully. Zoe Carmichael had canceled her high society wedding upon discovering her fiancé's infidelity, only to realize her heart had secretly belonged to a heroic, hard-working single father she had met months prior. It was a modern-day fairy tale, engineered perfectly to boost Carmichael's stock by 3% in a single afternoon. But fairy tales require a castle. "Whoa!" Ava whispered, her eyes wide as the private elevator doors opened directly into the foyer of Zoe's Beacon Hill penthouse. Ava was pale and moving slowly, clutching a stuffed elephant to her chest, but the color was already returning to her cheeks. She was wearing a comfortable pink tracksuit Aiden had bought her for the discharge. Aiden stepped out behind her, carrying their meager belongings in 2 duffel bags. He looked around the penthouse, feeling a deep, unsettling sense of vertigo. The apartment was a sprawling expanse of white marble, floor-to-ceiling glass offering a panoramic view of the Boston skyline, and minimalist, sharp-edged furniture that looked incredibly expensive and entirely uncomfortable. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a museum where happiness went to die. Zoe was waiting in the living room, wearing cashmere loungewear that likely cost more than Aiden's truck had. She looked incredibly nervous. "Welcome," Zoe said awkwardly, stepping forward. I had my assistant set up the guest wing for you both. There are no stairs, so Ava won't have to exert herself. And I hired a private pediatric nurse to be on call 24/7. Aiden dropped the bags. "You didn't have to do that. It's part of the arrangement," Zoe replied quickly, deflecting the gratitude. "Arthur's private investigators are watching the building. They tipped off the press. There are telephoto lenses aimed at the balcony right now. We have to live together. We have to be seen together." Ava, entirely oblivious to the tension, tugged on Zoe's cashmere sleeve. "Are you a princess?" Zoe blinked, looking down at the little girl. She had 0 experience with children. No. I'm a chief executive officer." Ava frowned. "Does a chief executive have a TV?" A tiny, genuine smile broke through Zoe's icy exterior. "I have a very big TV. Would you like to see it?" Over the next 2 weeks, the penthouse underwent a bizarre transformation. The sterile, silent museum was suddenly filled with the sounds of Saturday morning cartoons, the smell of Aiden cooking real meals in the untouched designer kitchen, and the sight of Ava's coloring books scattered across the imported Italian glass coffee tables. Aiden was a revelation to Zoe. He was relentlessly competent. When the ice maker in her smart fridge broke, he didn't call the building superintendent. He grabbed a toolbox he'd insisted on bringing and fixed it in 10 minutes. He woke up early, made coffee, and made sure Ava took her medications with military precision. And, slowly, Zoe found herself lingering in the kitchen in the mornings. She found herself sitting on the floor with Ava, awkwardly learning how to play a game called Go Fish. She found herself looking at Aiden when he was reading on the couch, admiring the strong line of his jaw and the quiet safety he radiated. They were playing a dangerous game of house, and the lines were beginning to blur. One rainy Tuesday evening, after Ava had been put to bed, Aiden walked out onto the massive terrace. Zoe was already there, leaning against the glass railing, holding a glass of wine and looking out over the glittering city. Aiden stepped up beside her. She asked if you were going to read her a bedtime story tomorrow. Zoe looked down into her wine glass. "I wouldn't know how. I don't know the voices. You negotiate billion-dollar shipping routes. Zoe, you can handle the very hungry caterpillar." She let out a soft laugh, turning to face him. The city lights cast a warm, golden glow on her face. The corporate armor was off. "You've changed everything here. Aiden, this place. It was a tomb before you and Ava arrived. Now it feels alive." Aiden looked at her, his heart beating a little faster. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Zoe didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. "Zoe," Aiden murmured, leaning in slightly. Suddenly, Thomas Avery's voice shattered the quiet intimacy. "I apologize for the intrusion," the lawyer said, stepping onto the terrace holding a thick manila folder. He looked grim. Zoe instantly stepped back from Aiden, clearing her throat. "What is it?" "Thomas." "It's Arthur," Thomas said, handing the folder to Zoe. "He's found a loophole, or rather, a person." Aiden frowned. "What person?" "Arthur dug into your past. Mr. Hensley," Thomas said grimly. "He couldn't find anything to smear you with, so he found someone who would. 3 hours ago, Arthur Carmichael filed a petition in family court on behalf of a new client." Zoe opened the folder. Inside was a glossy, high-definition photograph of a woman with dyed blonde hair, stepping out of Arthur's black SUV. Aiden's blood turned to ice. "Sarah, your ex-wife," Thomas confirmed. "She is claiming that you coerced her into abandoning custody 5 years ago, and she is filing for emergency full custody of Ava, alleging that you have brought her into a dangerous, fraudulent situation with the Carmichael family." Zoe looked up, her eyes wide with horror. "Arthur is trying to take your daughter." Aiden stared at the photograph, his hands balling into fists so tight his knuckles cracked. The woman who had abandoned them when Ava first got sick was back, armed with billionaire lawyers, ready to tear his family apart just to break a corporate contract. "He crossed the line," Aiden said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. He looked at Zoe, his eyes burning with a dark fire. "Your uncle wants a war! Tell him he just got one!" The following morning, the atmosphere inside the penthouse was toxic with tension. Aiden hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night sitting in an armchair by Ava's door, acting as a physical barricade between his daughter and a threat she didn't even know existed. His mind was a tempest of rage and terror. Sarah hadn't just walked away 5 years ago. She had fled. When the pediatricians first detected Ava's heart murmur and outlined the mountain of medical interventions required, Sarah had packed a single suitcase while Aiden was at work. She had left a 3-sentence note on the kitchen counter, claiming she wasn't built for this. For 5 years, Aiden had worked his fingers to the bone, holding his daughter through every fever, every tear, and every terrifying hospital visit. Sarah hadn't sent so much as a birthday card. Now, backed by Arthur Carmichael's limitless wealth, she was trying to take the only thing Aiden had left. Zoe walked into the hallway just as the sun began to cast a pale light over the Boston skyline. She was already dressed in a sharp, slate-gray power suit, holding a steaming mug of black coffee. She looked at Aiden, seeing the dark circles under his eyes, the rigid set of his jaw. The sight of his pain stirred a fiercely protective instinct inside her, a feeling she had previously only reserved for her company. "She's still asleep," Aiden rasped, rubbing a hand over his stubbled face. "I'm not letting her go, Zoe. I don't care about the contract. I don't care about the company. If I have to take Ava and disappear, I will." Zoe knelt beside his chair, an action that would have seemed completely alien to her just 3 weeks ago. "You are not disappearing, Aiden, and Sarah is not taking Ava." "You don't understand," Aiden said, his voice cracking. "Arthur has the best lawyers in the country. I'm a guy who installs drywall and just got married to a billionaire in a diner. They are going to paint me as an opportunistic grifter who dragged a sick child into a dangerous corporate fraud scheme. A judge will look at Sarah, a crying mother who claims I alienated her, and hand Ava right over." "Arthur has the best corporate lawyers," Zoe corrected, her voice cold and absolute. "But he forgot one crucial detail. He's dealing with me, and I have resources that make Arthur look like an amateur." She stood up, pulling out her phone. "Thomas Avery and my crisis management team have been working since midnight. I am not playing defense anymore. Aiden, Arthur brought a war to my home. Now, I am going to burn his to the ground. By noon, the battlefield was set. Sarah, flanked by two of Arthur's highly paid family law attorneys, had audaciously requested an immediate mediation session, hoping to intimidate Aiden into a settlement that would likely involve him walking away from Zoe and signing over full custody. They chose a neutral location, a sleek conference room in a high-end downtown law firm. Aiden walked into the room, wearing the same cheap navy suit he had worn to City Hall. But this time, he wasn't alone. Zoe walked right beside him, radiating a terrifying, absolute authority. Thomas Avery trailed behind them, carrying a single, slim leather briefcase. Sarah was sitting at the glass table. She looked exactly as Aiden remembered. Sharp features, dyed blonde hair, and a practiced look of victimhood. But when she saw Aiden, a flicker of genuine nervousness crossed her eyes. "Aiden," Sarah said, putting a hand to her chest. "It's been so long. I've missed her so much." Aiden's hands balled into fists. He opened his mouth, but Zoe smoothly stepped in front of him, placing her designer handbag on the glass table with a sharp, echoing thud. "Save the performance, Sarah," Zoe said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "There are no cameras here, and the judge hasn't arrived yet. Let's get right to the bottom line." One of Sarah's lawyers, a slick man named Harrison, frowned. "Mrs. Hensley, this is a family court matter regarding custody. Your presence here is highly irregular. My presence here is because this woman is attempting to use my stepdaughter as leverage in a hostile corporate takeover, orchestrated by Arthur Carmichael." Zoe fired back, locking eyes with Sarah. "You left your daughter 5 years ago because you couldn't handle the medical bills. You didn't care if she lived or died. And now, suddenly, 3 days after Ava receives a life-saving surgery, paid for by my accounts, by the way, you care." Sarah flushed angrily. "You don't know anything about me. I was coerced. Aiden forced me out." "Out? Did he?" Zoe asked, leaning over the table. "Because that's a fascinating narrative. Almost as fascinating as the wire transfer of $250,000 made from a shell company in the Cayman Islands directly to your newly opened checking account 48 hours ago." The color completely drained from Sarah's face. Harrison, the lawyer, stiffened, exchanging a panicked look with his co-counsel. Aiden looked at Zoe, stunned. She had found the paper trail. Thomas Avery stepped forward, opening his briefcase and sliding a stack of heavily redacted bank statements across the table. Arthur Carmichael's holding company, Blackwood Industries, initiated the transfer. We have the routing numbers. We also have sworn affidavits from 3 of Arthur's junior associates, confirming he sought out Sarah specifically to file this fraudulent claim to extort my client into surrendering her controlling shares. "This is illegally obtained financial information," Harrison sputtered, standing up. "It's a whistleblower leak," Thomas corrected with a shark-like smile. "Perfectly admissible when proving extortion and bribery. If you pursue this custody petition, we will not only countersue for legal fees, but we will hand these documents over to the district attorney. Extortion carries a federal prison sentence, and Arthur Carmichael will throw you to the wolves the second he realizes he's caught." Zoe looked down at the trembling woman who had broken Aiden's heart 5 years ago. "Withdraw the petition. Sarah, sign a permanent relinquishment of all parental rights. Today, in this room, you keep the $250,000 Arthur paid you. Consider it severance for your complete failure as a mother. But if you ever come within 50 miles of Ava or my husband again, I will personally see to it that you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary." Sarah stared at the documents, her breathing shallow. She looked at Aiden, searching for any trace of the soft, forgiving man she had left behind. But Aiden's eyes were like granite. "Where do I sign?" Sarah whispered. The victory in the mediation room secured Ava's safety. But the war for Carmichael Global was still raging. Arthur, unaware that his pawn had just folded, had called an emergency meeting of the board of directors for that very afternoon. His goal was to present the impending custody battle and the scandal of Zoe's marriage as grounds to invoke a morality and competency clause, thereby stripping her of her CEO title and freezing the trust. When Zoe and Aiden walked into the Carmichael Global boardroom on the 60th floor, the room was packed. 15 board members, mostly older men in bespoke suits who had been loyal to Arthur for years, sat around the sprawling mahogany table. Arthur sat at the head, looking immensely pleased with himself. "Ah, Zoe," Arthur sneered as she walked in. "And the carpenter. How touching that you brought your hired help to your own corporate execution. I assume Sarah's lawyers have already served you with the custody papers. A tragic situation. The press is going to have a field day when they find out you bought a husband who is currently losing his child to the state." Zoe didn't sit down. She stood at the opposite end of the table, Aiden standing firmly beside her like a sentinel. "There will be no custody battle, Arthur," Zoe said, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. She gestured to Thomas Avery, who began passing thick dossiers to every board member at the table. Arthur's smug expression faltered. "What is this?" "This," Zoe said, pacing slowly behind the chairs of her board members, "is a detailed, legally authenticated record of a $250,000 bribe paid by you, Arthur, to Sarah Hensley. It outlines your attempt to manufacture a fraudulent custody battle to manipulate Carmichael Global's stock price and force my resignation." A collective gasp echoed around the boardroom. Pages rustled frantically as the executives read the undeniable proof. "This is a fabrication," Arthur shouted, slamming his fist on the table. His face was turning a dangerous shade of magenta. "She's lying. She forged these documents to cover up her sham marriage." "I also included the permanent relinquishment of parental rights signed by Sarah an hour ago," Zoe continued smoothly, ignoring his outburst. "And an audio recording of Sarah's lawyer confirming the source of the funds. You tried to weaponize a 7-year-old girl recovering from heart surgery to steal my company, Arthur." She stopped pacing and locked eyes with the board. "My grandfather built Carmichael Global on integrity. Arthur has not only breached his fiduciary duty, but he has exposed this company to massive federal criminal liability. If the SEC or the district attorney sees these documents, Arthur will be indicted." The room was dead silent. The board members, men who prioritized profit and stability above all else, looked at Arthur as if he were suddenly radioactive. "You can't do this!" Arthur roared, standing up. "I own 30% of this company. I am a Carmichael. You're a liability!" Zoe fired back, her voice ringing with finality. "And as the majority shareholder, having officially fulfilled the terms of the trust, I am calling for an immediate vote. I move to strip Arthur Carmichael of his board seat, terminate his operational role within the company, and force a buyout of his shares at current market value." "Seconded," said an elderly board member near the front, looking at Arthur with sheer disgust. The vote was unanimous. In less than 10 minutes, Arthur Carmichael's 30-year reign of terror within the company was systematically dismantled. Security was called to escort him out of the building. As 2 large guards flanked him, Arthur stopped beside Zoe, his eyes burning with venom. "You think this makes you a winner, Zoe?" he hissed. "You still bought a husband. The second this blows over, he's going to take your money and leave you in that glass tower all by yourself." Zoe didn't flinch. She just stared at him, until the guards pulled him away. when the boardroom finally cleared, leaving only Zoe, Aiden, and Thomas Avery. The adrenaline that had been sustaining Zoe for the past 24 hours suddenly evaporated. Her knees buckled slightly, and she caught herself on the back of a leather chair. Aiden was there in an instant, his strong hands gripping her shoulders, steadying her. "Hey, I've got you," he said softly. Zoe looked up at him. The fierce, terrifying CEO melted away, leaving only the woman who had cried on the diner floor. "It's over," she whispered. "He can't hurt us anymore. He can't hurt Ava." Aiden pulled her into a tight, crushing hug. "You did it. Zoe, you saved us." Zoe buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of sawdust, clean laundry, and safety. For the first time in her life, she realized that protecting her empire meant absolutely nothing compared to protecting the man holding her. 6 months later, the air in Boston had thawed, welcoming a vibrant, blooming spring. Inside the penthouse, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were open, letting in the warm breeze. The apartment looked entirely different now. There were framed finger paintings on the refrigerator, a small pile of shoes by the door, and the constant, joyful sound of Ava's laughter echoing through the halls. Her heart was completely healed, her cheeks rosy and full of life, but a heavy, unspoken dread hung in the air between Aiden and Zoe. Today was the 180th day, the day the contract on the diner napkin expired. Aiden was in the guest bedroom, quietly packing his duffel bags. He folded a flannel shirt, his chest tight with an agonizing ache. Over the past 6 months, he had fallen completely, hopelessly in love with his wife. He had watched Zoe transform from a rigid, guarded executive into a woman who would sit on the floor in her designer pajamas to help Ava build Lego castles. He had shared late-night conversations with her over cheap takeout, discovering her fears, her brilliant mind, and her deeply hidden warmth. But a deal was a deal. Zoe's position at the company was completely secure. The press had lost interest. She didn't need a fake husband anymore. He was just a drywaller. She was a titan of industry. It was time for him to step out of her world and give her back her life. He zipped up the bag and walked out into the living room. Zoe was standing by the glass doors of the terrace, looking out at the city. She was wearing a simple white sundress, her hair cascading down her shoulders. When she heard the heavy thud of the duffel bag hitting the floor, she turned around. Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's day 180, Aiden said, forcing a tight, painful smile. "Thomas sent the annulment papers over this morning. I signed them and left them on the kitchen island. You're completely free, Zoe. The trust is yours. The company is yours." Zoe looked at the duffel bags, her heart shattering in her chest. She had spent the last agonizing over this exact moment, terrified that Aiden was counting the seconds until he could take his daughter and leave this chaotic corporate life behind. "You're leaving," she stated, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "I have to," Aiden said, his voice breaking. "I kept my end of the bargain. You kept yours. Ava is alive because of you. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful to you, Zoe. But you don't have to pretend anymore. You can go back to your real life." "My real life," Zoe repeated, taking a step toward him. The tears spilled over, tracing tracks down her cheeks. "My real life before you was an empty penthouse and a boardroom full of people who wanted to see me fail. My real life before you was crying on a diner floor because I realized I had absolutely no one in the world who actually cared about me." Aiden froze, his hands gripping the strap of his bag. Zoe reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a folded, slightly wrinkled yellow paper napkin. "The contract. You told me that day at the diner that we were saving each other, Zoe said, her voice shaking with raw emotion. You saved my company, Aiden, but then you saved me. You and Ava brought light into a place that was completely dark. You stood between me and everyone who tried to hurt me. You made me a family. She held the napkin up, her dark eyes locking onto his. I am the CEO of Carmichael Global, Zoe said fiercely. I don't make bad investments, and letting you walk out that door would be the worst mistake of my entire life. With a swift, decisive motion, she ripped the napkin in half. Then she ripped it again and again, letting the pieces flutter to the marble floor like confetti. I don't want an annulment, Zoe cried, closing the distance between them. I want you. I want my husband. Aiden dropped the bag completely. In 2 strides, he crossed the room and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He kissed her. Not a fake kiss for the cameras, not a polite peck for the lawyers, but a desperate, passionate, earth-shattering kiss that held 6 months of unspoken love. Zoe wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back with everything she had, tears of pure joy soaking between their cheeks. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless and smiling like idiots. A small voice interrupted them. Are we still going to get ice cream? They turned to see Ava standing in the hallway, wearing a bright yellow dress and holding her stuffed elephant, looking completely unbothered by the dramatic romantic climax happening in the living room. Aiden laughed, a rich, booming sound that filled the penthouse. He set Zoe down but kept his arm tightly wrapped around her waist. Yeah, bug, Aiden said, grinning at his daughter. We're going to get ice cream. Zoe looked up at Aiden, resting her head against his shoulder. The empire was secure, the enemies were defeated, but looking at the man holding her and the little girl smiling at them, she knew exactly what her greatest asset was. It wasn't the billions in the bank, or the name on the building. It was the family she had found on a rainy night in a greasy diner. They walked out the door together, leaving the shredded contract on the floor, and stepping into a future that was finally, truly, theirs. And that is the incredible story of Aiden and Zoe, from a desperate plea in a late-night diner to defeating a corrupt billionaire uncle. It proves that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. What was your favorite moment in their journey? Did you cheer when Aiden stood up in the boardroom, or when Zoe shredded the contract? Let me know in the comments. If you love this story of unexpected love and fierce protection, please smash that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. Thanks for watching.